Alright guys, part 2 of body mechanics involved during cutting. Now I will go over the rest of the body as far as the mechanics involved during cutting. So first off, it starts with your lower body to get that stance. So I usually go with what's commonly referred to as a bow stance. Have your lead leg forward, bent, and your knee at an angle, and then your back leg is going to be relatively straight, and both your feet should be planted firmly on the ground. So you should have your center uh, uh, body mass completely controlled between your two legs. Now, your lead leg should always be facing in the direction away from your cut. So in this case, my right leg is out, so that means that I will start cutting from my right side and towards my left. I never cut in the opposite direction as a general rule, simply because you make an accident and then you hit your leg, you're gonna injure yourself, um, and that's not very pleasant. So the same thing would apply for um, all the different cuts that you do. So have your lead leg for facing out in the direction that you're starting the cut, not where you end the cut. Um, now, um, coordinating your upper body is pretty complicated, I would say, because there's so many different body parts moving that trying to coordinate all of them together uh, to have an efficient and powerful cutting movement is pretty difficult unless you practice a lot or you're some kind of genius. But for the rest of us mortals, practice is where it's at. You have to become familiar with how to train your body, your joints, your muscles, develop that muscle memory so that you can establish good technique for whatever style of cutting that you choose. Now, for me, when I cut, I showed you in the previous video, I have my hand all the way forward, touching the guard, and my non-dominant hand towards the back of the suga. You can choose whatever hand position you would like. It's all up to you. It's an individual preference. Um, this is just what I prefer. Now, for the body mechanics, I'll go over some different styles and I'll explain as I go. The first style is you take your stance. Now, the first style is where you would really extend the sword and draw as wide of an arc as you can through the air. Now, this requires a lot of space. So you can see here, I really extend my body and my elbows. So for cutting a technique like this, you would gain pretty good power, good range as far as the extension of the blade, um, but you're lacking in a little bit of flexibility of movement and efficiency of movement, because this movement starts really from your shoulders and your elbows. So you would extend your elbows out first, there, and then you're also moving your shoulders a tiny bit. And at the time that you start drawing the arc with your sword, you're also snapping your wrists at an even speed. So you would, at the same time, you extend your elbows and snap your wrists, you're drawing the largest arc you can through the air. And once you contact your target right about here, then you would start to pull back with your non-dominant hand and bring it in towards yourself for a slicing motion. Now the slicing motion, that'll remain the same for any type of cut you do. The reason for this is because a slicing motion helps facilitate separation of the target. And because a katana is usually curved with a single edge, the slicing motion and the curve of the blade work really well together to facilitate separation of the target, whatever it may be. Now, that motion which I showed you is extremely wide. You can get good power, good range as far as reaching out towards your target. However, what I find is that it puts a lot of strain on your shoulders because your elbows right here and your wrists are moving at a relatively constant speed. So it's kind of like you're throwing the weight out as far as you can. And if you do it fast, then you're definitely going to feel some strain in your shoulders because it's like your arms are like pieces of string. And if you swing a heavy object, um, the the part that the string is attached to is going to experience a lot of stress. And in this case, it's your shoulders. So um, this is an extreme movement, I would say. Um, if you do movements like this over a long period of time, you would definitely get really strong shoulders, but at the same time, you may risk injuring your shoulders through, I guess, wear and tear. Now, on the polar opposite of that, you have an extremely short and efficient compact movement. So let me show you here. You start with your stance, and the movement starts with your shoulder. Once it starts with your shoulder, you partially extend your elbows. And as you bring it down, you're not going to snap your wrists at an even pace as with the other movement. You're going to start with your shoulders, extend your elbows, and keep your wrists bent until the last moment. And then when you're roughly have the tsuka in front of the target, then at the very last moment, you would snap your wrists to gain extreme tip acceleration and come down and contact the target. And then for the follow through, of course, you would bring the sword in towards you for that slicing motion. So it looks something like this. Now, a motion like that is very efficient. It doesn't put as much strain on your joints as with the other motion that I showed you. However, what you're gaining in speed and tip acceleration, you're losing out on power. So between those two examples, I like to try to find the in-between. But I actually favor more towards the first style where I extend my reach a little bit. Um, so it'll look something like this. For my style, I follow with a good reach. However, I try to hold back snapping my wrists until later on during the strike. Of course, with reaching out, you don't want to overextend your elbows where your arms will be completely straight. Maintain some flex in them. Otherwise, if you always overextend your elbows, then you're going to receive shock in your elbows, and that may injure you in some point in time. So you would go and, for my style, extend your elbows, turn your shoulders, and then follow through with snapping of the wrist and slicing motion. So it'll look like this. It's sort of like a in-between between the two different styles I showed you. Um, all I can say is experiment. Um, you want to try to find what style works particularly well for you. Um, there's a lot of other factors that play into separation of the target, and you have what's called a cutting motion and also a slicing motion. So cutting is basically when the sword stays in a stable, I guess, stable range of motion without without moving forwards or moving backwards. So it would stay in the same plane of motion, and then the target is there, and you just slice through it, or not slice through, you cut through it. That's what a cut is. A slicing motion is when the edge drags through the target as you're passing through, as in you pull the blade towards yourself and separate the target, or the blade goes forwards and the edge runs along inside the target and separates it that way. What you want to try to get is an in-between of both cutting and slicing, because that'll help facilitate separation of the target much more efficiently. Now, so far I've explained grip, hand position, and the different body mechanics involved during cutting. As far as a vertical strike goes, um, you do have some, I guess, not minor, more detailed techniques that you would sometimes find with martial artists. So a Dodon strike or vertical strike consists of the moves which I showed you, or the body mechanics, where you would lead with your shoulders and your elbows, swing the sword, and snap your wrists and come into contact with the target. And then what some martial artists do is they turn their wrists inward and tighten up their ring finger and their pinky finger as they come into contact with the target. And with the motion you already generated from moving your shoulders, your elbows, and snapping your wrists, you would torque your wrists in like this as you come into contact with the target, pass through, and for the follow through, you drag the sword in towards you for that slicing motion. Now, the reason for turning your wrists in during a cut is it looks fairly minor. However, its effect is pretty profound in that when you contact the target, the shockwave is going to be sent from the sword and through your hand, into your wrist, into your arm, and into your main upper body, and so forth. Um, the physics of the cut, when you contact the target, all that force traveling through the blade is going to come into your arms, and then since a lot of people grip the sword with their arms at a sideways angle from the blade, that force is going to be dissipated extremely easily through your arms and into your body. Your body is going to absorb that impact. Therefore, you're losing the force or momentum you generated as you cut through a target. So what you want to try to do to maintain that momentum is turn your wrists in. Now what this does is this focuses more power down your central line or axis, and that focuses the power directly, or more directly, behind the central axis of the sword itself. And this makes your cut technically a little more efficient as far as power and energy transfer. So that's some minor techniques that you should probably look into. It's something that you have to coordinate with the rest of your upper body. Um, so for a vertical strike, something like that is a really good practice swing to do. So that way you can coordinate all of your body movements together, make sure everything is timed correctly, and that you don't pull yourself off balance. When I first started, what happened was I would take a swing and then I find myself moving forward with the sword. I get dragged along into the sword's cutting movement and I lose my center of balance. That's something you don't want to do because, first off, in a martial or fighting scenario, you're overextending yourself. You're leaving a huge open target. You're basically getting closer to the enemy. Um, that's usually something you don't want to do, especially when you're fighting with weapons. Um, I mean, if you're close to the enemy, you're pulled off balance. It's harder for you to react quickly in the case of an attack. So, I mean, your head could go flying right there. So, make sure that you keep your center of balance, that your stance is solid. You want usually to have your feet planted on the ground firmly. Um, so keep all those in mind as you go through cutting motions. The next part, the third part of this series, I will go over different cutting angles and how to facilitate easier separation of the target.